The first 3 episodes of Constellation have just been released on Apple TV, and this is a show I have been very excited about from the moment I first heard about it. With some strong interstellar vibes, I knew this would be something that would grab a lot of people's attention, and I must say the first 3 episodes really have me on the edge of my seat. So let's jump in and break down the first 3 episodes of Constellation and talk about the major takeaways as we move into the rest of the season. Now, there's a lot of time jumping going on in this show, and from what I can tell, there are 2 main timelines. Present day in northern Sweden, where Joe is trying to find the real Alice, and then 5 weeks earlier, where we have Joe up at the space station, eventually reuniting with her family back on Earth, only to find things are not how she left them. So let's start in present day, where things kick off with our main character Joe driving on a snowy road with her daughter Alice while listening to a strange recording in another language, and Alice asking what happened to her father. After watching all 3 episodes and now coming back to this opening scene, I believe the voice on this tape may be Irene. As we'll talk about in a moment, I believe Joe really did see a body out in space and that it was Irene from her space mission many years earlier. It's pretty clear that she and Henry seem to know things nobody else does, so I think something happened up there where one Irene remained in space and another came home, much like what I believe is happening with Joe, which we'll get into later. After settling into their cabin, we can hear a voice yelling "Mama" off in the distance, along with a light in the fog as Joe heads out after it. She eventually stumbles upon what seems to be another version of the cabin she just left, and as she heads upstairs, she discovers the same wardrobe she saw up in space during a scene where she had lost contact with Earth and was hearing strange noises. Joe opens the door to find another Alice, the real one, inside. In the following episode, Joe brings Alice back to the other cabin where she draws her a bath and says that Alice smells like her again. Joe goes to boil water to warm up the bath and remembers the other Alice sleeping in the bedroom. As she heads back to the bathroom, that Alice is gone and she's left with the seemingly wrong Alice yet again. We come back at the end of the episode with Joe looking again for the real Alice, retrieving the Cal device and heading out as she says they need to go and find the other Alice. It seems here that the Cal device may be a vital component for merging these multiple realities and allowing Joe to see and interact with both dimensions. We'll have to keep an eye on this moving forward to see if that remains to be true. In episode 3, Joe and the wrong Alice are heading across a frozen lake to get back to the other cabin, and Alice is dropping markers as they go so they can find their way back. Later, Alice says she doesn't think there's another cabin because she notices that they're walking past the beads that she had dropped earlier on. Joe tells Alice that she doesn't think she's her daughter, and Alice says, "Then who are you and what have you done to my mom?" As the camera pans out, we can see police vehicles approaching, which, as you'll recall back in episode 1, a police car was also right behind Joe's car, turned on its light, and drove past her. So there may be something else going on nearby. And that pretty much does it for present day from these first 3 episodes. Next, we'll move into the events that happened 5 weeks earlier. So yeah, the next major setting of the show takes place in a flashback from 5 weeks before, where Joe is up in the space station and a fellow astronaut named Paul is working with the Cal device we saw Joe carrying around in present day. We learn it's being used to discover a new state of matter, and just as they're firing it up, there's an explosion of some kind and things erupt into chaos, eventually leading to Paul's death. They find that several systems are damaged and Joe needs to do a spacewalk in order to get everything back online, and while doing so, she begins looking for signs of what hit them and eventually finds the dead body of a Russian cosmonaut. But Joe appears to be the only person who saw it. Back on the ground, Henry is talking through the situation when he walks past a window where we see a reflection of himself in the glass that appears to be observing through the reflection. This is further proof that we're looking at some kind of multi-dimensional story here. Also, this is the first of many uses of mirrors and reflections in the show, so I think this will be an important component and common theme throughout, most likely representing 2 different dimensions. Henry says the Cal experiments identified a new state of matter only present in 0 gravity, and they can't just walk away from that. The crew is informed that 3 of them will need to head back in 1 spacecraft while Joe remains on board to perform repairs and return later. Joe's told that she has 19 hours of oxygen to complete the work needed to get her home safely. While working on the ship, she ends up next to the Cal device and appears to be transported to another dimension where she sees Alice's necklace hanging on the same wardrobe that she would later find in the cabin in Denmark, and that she also sees in episode 3 after falling down during a walk with Alice. As mentioned earlier, this happened while next to the Cal device, making me think this thing is playing a big role in what's going on in the show. In the following episode, Jo is recording a memo to send to her family when she hears a strange noise. She plays back the recording and hears Paul telling her she needs to stop breathing and to stay where she is. She then finds Paul Paul's severed hand floating through a door, and as she grabs it, she sees a very alive Paul until she lets go and he disappears. Jo completes the battery work and begins preparing to undock, but she receives a mechanical failure error that requires 2 crew members to resolve. When it looks like all hope is lost, we see a figure back inside the space station who clears the issue for Jo, and she successfully undocks and heads back to Earth. Now, at first I thought that this was Paul, but personally I believe this person to be another version of Jo, and is in fact the version of Jo that belongs in the current dimension. So now that the original Jo that we met is heading back to Earth, she's going to find herself in a very different world. One other very important thing that happens in this episode is this conversation between Irene and Henry.
You heard from your sister?
I think you know that she has passed away. Have you heard from your brother?
Not in many years. Thank God.
Now, I don't believe they're talking about actual brothers and sisters here. I think they're really calling the other interdimensional versions of themselves their brothers and sisters, which is further supported by this scene where we find a Bud Caldera being interviewed by a news outlet and being very upset when he's addressed as Henry. More on this theory in a bit. Jo makes it back to Earth, and after landing and opening the hatch, sees a wolf of some kind, or at least a version of one, just before the crews arrive, and she's reunited with Alice and Magnus. However, we can see that Alice no longer has her scars on her head, and Magnus responds strangely to Jo's comments about loving him, immediately solidifying my theory that this Jo has returned to an unfamiliar dimension. Also, Frederick gives Jo a very suspicious look, making me think they had something going on between them, which is proven to be true later in the next episode, when he tries to console Jo and she's very put off by him. Just as Jo and her family are about to take off in the helicopter, we see Alice alone and calling out to her mom. Then Jo alone as well, but then they're all back together again. However, when Jo tries to speak to Alice in Swedish, she doesn't appear to understand the language like she had before Jo left space. Moving into episode 3, Jo is having a meal with everyone when she accidentally calls Frida Erica when giving her condolences about Paul. This is another clue to me that this Jo is in the wrong dimension, and where she's from, Paul's wife's name is Erica. We then see Henry looking through data from the Cal device that mirrored what they saw on the space station. Then we cut to Bud on the cruise ship preparing to meet fans at a convention and engage in some kind of debate. A big focus this episode is on Jo's recollection of what hit the space station, which she continues to state was the body of a Russian cosmonaut, but eventually concedes that it was space trash after being pressed time and time again by various members in the room. Most importantly, Irene, who again, I believe is actually the dead body that Jo saw in space. Later, Jo is performing some physical tests, and then she's given the same red and yellow pills that Henry and Irene have been taking as well. She's told to take them until further notice and that they're just folic acid and vitamins. Something tells me this isn't actually the case. Next, we're back in the lab with Henry as he's looking over data from the Cal experiment, where he again observes what was recorded out in space. He tries to take pictures with his phone, but they don't show what he's seen on the screen, so he instead traces it with a piece of paper. We then see Alice playing hide and seek with Wendy, and while hiding, she sees Wendy throw her stuffed rabbit in a puddle and stomp on it, but when she goes to confront her about it, there's nobody there. Alice then finds Wendy outside where they argue about the rabbit, which clearly hadn't been mistreated after all. This is the first time we're shown a character other than Jo experiencing something like this, and I did notice that this Alice has the scar on her forehead again. That said, as I looked back through these episodes, it seems there are times where she has the scar and seems to be the wrong Alice, and times where she doesn't have the scar and seems to be the wrong Alice. So now I'm wondering if we're being shown both dimensions but not being told that? I don't know. I'm a little lost here, honestly. Henry and Alice chat in what I believe is an important reference point for the entire show. Henry explains quantum physics with an example of a particle that can be in two places at once. White in one spot, black in another, and black and white somewhere in between, and that it doesn't decide which color it is until someone looks at it. Henry says he invented a machine that was sent to space to get answers, and Alice asks if it worked. Henry says he's not sure, he thinks so, but it doesn't seem like it wants to be seen. Later, Jo is walking with her crew, and she says she found the suit online that matched the one worn by the dead cosmonaut that hit the space station. She shows them a picture and is told that the woman in the image was Irene, and Jo says, well, I'm not saying it was her, but to me, this further supports my idea that it was Irene, or another dead version of Irene, that did, in fact, hit the space station. The crew then visits a memorial tree for Paul, where Jo asks for a moment alone. After everyone leaves, she sees Paul, and he says, somewhere in space hangs my heart. From it stream sparks into other intemperate hearts, which comes from a poem written by Edith Sodergren that focuses on the exploration of one's place in the universe. Back at home, Jo asks if they got a new car because she remembered having one of a different color, and both Alice and Magnus deny it's new. Even more proof that the wrong Jo came back from that space mission. Next, we see two versions of Henry again, Bud on the cruise ship and Henry in his apartment meeting with Irene, who tells him she's dying of cancer. He starts playing music, and as they dance, we see Bud hearing the same music on his cruise ship as he finds the guy he was debating earlier and says they need to go for a walk, where they discuss Bud's Apollo mission. Bud talks about how he fixed everything on the mission, and one moment his crew was alive and the next they were dead. Bud says it was Henry Caldera's fault, proving that he is also aware of the other version of himself. And moments later, the guy calls Bud a fraud, which sets him off, and he tosses the guy off the back of the ship. Okay, that was a lot to try to cover from these first 3 episodes of the show, but I gotta say I'm really enjoying it all. I'm a big fan of Interstellar, as I said earlier in the episode, and I'm really getting a lot of the same vibes here, so I think we are in for a wild and invigorating ride. So far, things feel a bit confusing as we work to establish the rules of this universe, but I think I'm starting to get a grasp as to where we might be headed. That said, I've definitely been wrong before, so I'd love to hear what you all are thinking. Do you agree with the theories I've laid out here, or do you have other ideas for what may be going on? Let me know down in the comments, and I hope to see you in future episode breakdowns. Thanks for watching. See you next time.